Hello and welcome to day 4 of the Global 16 Days campaign, also known as 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence. This is the third event that Equality Bahamas is hosting as a part of the campaign this year. And we are really excited to have our very own Marion Bethel joining us, attorney at law, as well as a member of the CEDAW Committee, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. We're going to learn a lot more about Cdaw, so don't worry if you've never heard of it before. Even if you have heard of it, there's a lot left to learn. There's also always so much to learn about UN conventions and other international mechanisms. And Marion Bethel is here to walk us through this one in very general terms in a sort of 101, but also delving a little bit deeper to understand how we can use it as an advocacy tool to end gender-based violence, with specific focus on 4 articles looking at health, education, employment, and rural women, which in our context, we're talking about family island women. For this session, we do have a presentation set. So we're going to work our way through that presentation, and then we'll open up for more specific questions and more engagement around the topic. Feel free to use the chat all throughout the session. When we get to the question and answer part, feel free to unmute yourselves. If you are watching live on Facebook, you can also participate. Just use the comment feature there and we'll be monitoring there for comments. And that is pretty much it, aside from the usual sort of standards where just be mindful of the amount of space that you're taking up when you're contributing. We want to hear from you, but we want to be able to hear from everyone else as well who wants to participate in the exchange. No racism, misogyny, sexism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, none of that will be tolerated. There will be no warnings. And once you're booted from the Zoom, you won't be let back in. So please, let's have respectful dialogue. It's okay to disagree, but we're going to do that in very respectful ways and always holding each other up. And with that, I'm passing it on to Marion. So Marion, please, to get us started, tell us about yourself a little bit and then dive in.
Okay, so I'm Marion, and please feel free to call me Marion. I'm currently a member of the UN CEDAW Committee, and this is my 2nd term. So each term is 4 years, and so I'm in my 5th year sitting on the committee, and it ends December 2024. So 3 more years, and I'm really pleased to be here with you. And I just want to thank Equality Bahamas and Alicia in particular for always supporting my efforts on the CEDAW Committee. And I think one of the things that really is attention for me as I sit on the UN CEDAW Committee in Geneva, I go 3 times a year and do the work there, is that I'm aware that I need to do much more work here in the Bahamas on CEDAW in terms of the awareness raising around it and public education. And so this is one of the vehicles that I'm using, and Alicia and Equality Bahamas have been so generous in offering me this platform. So hopefully by the end of my December 2024 term, CEDAW will be a home-based term, like, and everybody will be saying CEDAW and understanding it and knowing what it's about and using it, and that'll be just a wonderful accomplishment. So here we go. So I think that's it about me, Alicia. All right, so let's get started. And this is for Equality Bahamas in celebration or of the 16 days of activism, or honoring the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. So some of the questions that Alicia has put forward to me is, what is UN CEDAW? So UN CEDAW is United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And it was adopted in 1979, and it is really the human rights treaty for women and girls. And there are about 10 human rights treaties at the United Nations, and CEDAW is one of them. So they cover a range of human rights, such as persons with disabilities, a convention on racial discrimination, one on civil and political rights. There are 10 human rights treaties, and CEDAW is one of the 10. CEDAW itself currently has about 189 states parties that have ratified it, and there are about 196 states parties. So the ones that have not ratified CEDAW are Iran, Palau, Somalia, Sudan, Tonga, and the USA. And once you've ratified a convention or treaty, it's the same word, it means the same thing. It means that you, as a state or a country, you've agreed to respect, protect, fulfill, and promote the human rights of the treaty body that you're sitting on. In this case, the human rights of women under all circumstances. So CEDAW is widely known as the Treaty for the Rights of Women, and it's a tool that helps women and girls around the world to bring about change in our daily lives. And in countries that have ratified the treaty, CEDAW has proved invaluable in challenging the impact and effect of discrimination on women. And discrimination, as we have defined it, includes gender-based violence, poverty, lack of legal protections, policies and programs that should advance women's human rights. So UN CEDAW is an international treaty, and it's an agreement between countries. It is governed by international law. It is legally binding. So the Bahamas, having ratified CEDAW, is bound by international law to uphold and advance the human rights of women in the ways that the treaty sets out. And so the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties simply defines a treaty as an agreement concluded by states in written form and governed by international law. And so all of these human rights treaty bodies are based on the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which came out in 1948 at the UN, just post the 1945 establishment of the UN. I really encourage you to read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's a very accessible document, and it really grounds the issues of the dignity and worth of each and every individual human being. And you are entitled to human rights simply because you are human. So UN CEDAW has contributed to the development of many advancement of women's human rights in many parts of the world. So I'm just going to go through a few here. You can see them. Citizenship rights in Botswana and Japan, inheritance rights in Tanzania, access to safe abortion in Northern Ireland, laws concerning female genital mutilation in Mali, and a law in Rwanda prohibiting sex-based discrimination in access to land. CEDAW has also fostered adoption of domestic violence laws in various countries, Turkey, Nepal, South Africa, the Republic of Korea, and it has helped to legislate criminalizing all forms of violence against women in Burkina Faso, including femicide, the murders of women in Panama. A national inquiry was launched by CEDAW into missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada, again, dealing with femicides amongst Indigenous women in Canada. And so there are many ways in which CEDAW has not only fostered, but facilitated the advancement of women's human rights through the work that we do. How does the UN CEDAW work? So there are 23 independent experts that sit on the committee. I am one of 23 from around the world, and we are elected to this position. So what we do is that we monitor each and every country that has ratified the convention, simply agreed to being bound by the convention, and each country comes before us on a four-year cycle, and each country brings a report. We review that report. The country has a delegation that makes representations before us, and we have a discussion with that country. And we come up at the end of the day with what is called concluding observations, which are our recommendations, the CEDAW Committee's recommendations to this particular country to facilitate further advancement of human rights within that particular country. So the Bahamas appeared before CEDAW, for example, in November of 2018. And there were several Bahamians, NGOs who came. Alicia came as a representative of Equality Bahamas. Erin Green was there. Noel Nichols, Marion Bethel Sears, the there were several NGO women who came. And what happens is that NGOs are also participate in the process by giving reports to the CEDAW Committee in terms of what they see, the NGO sees from on the ground, what is happening in the Bahamas. That may be very different from what the Bahamas' official report looks like. So the CEDAW Committee monitors the implementation of the convention and ensures compliance with each and every article of the convention by the particular country that appears before us. So one of the main questions is that how does CEDAW respond to the issue of gender-based violence and structural violence? And so I'm highlighting 3 areas in which how CEDAW responds to this issue of gender-based violence, which is where we are in this moment in terms of 16 days of activism. So the 3 ways, when you look at them systematically, one is by recognizing principles of non-discrimination and equality and addressing discrimination. The second is by correcting continued discrimination against women. And the third is by creating rights that are designed specifically for our everyday lived lives. So the first one then, how does CEDAW respond to the issue of gender-based violence and structural violence? By recognizing the principles of non-discrimination and equality and addressing discrimination. I think it's really important that we look at some of these concepts so that we can see how, when we come to using CEDAW, there are legal terms that need to be used both by the country and by NGOs in forwarding and advancing women's human rights. So the principle of non-discrimination is based on the understanding that discrimination is socially constructed and built into our various social institutions and systems, the family, the church, the school, the corporate business, governance structures. So non-discrimination, we believe, is built into these systems and social structures. And this therefore recognizes the need for a concerted action to map discrimination and inequality across all sectors and the institutional mechanisms which perpetuate them in regard to the realization or the lack of realization of women's human rights. So the principle of non-discrimination is fundamental to each and every human rights treaty. And it is absolutely essential to CEDAW, the principle of non-discrimination. It is called a Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So Article 1 of UN CEDAW defines discrimination, and this is a legal discrimination that over and repeatedly we've asked the Bahamas and other countries to actually use in their legislation. And it is also one which then judges in their domestic situations will also use. So the term discrimination against women means any distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of sex, which has the effect or purpose of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise by women, irrespective of their marital status, on a basis of equality of men and women, of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. All right, so this is the discrimination that is Article 1 of the convention, and we systematically request that states parties incorporate this definition into their constitutions and their laws regarding human rights. So the second way that we deal with addressing structural and gender-based violence is by correcting continued discrimination against women. So despite legal rights being granted to women in many countries, discrimination still persists, and it persists worldwide, as you know. And women's access to legal rights are hampered or hindered by the denial of women's rights to social and economic development. So UN CEDAW rests on core principles, which A, demand that power relations between women and men at all levels, the family, the church, the business, governance, the market economy, and the state be transformed. So we recognize that there is a huge imbalance between power, access to resources, between women and men at all levels. And so in recognizing that, we go back to issues of embedded discrimination in systems and structures. Another core principle that UN CEDAW uses is we have discarded the distinction between the private and the public spheres by recognizing violations of women in the private sphere as violations of women's human rights. Now, there was a time when, certainly back in 1979, when CEDAW was first put forward or promulgated, the issue of the private sphere was still sacrosanct, meaning the domestic sphere, the family sphere in some ways, particularly in terms of gender-based violence. There still wasn't a lot of the volume in terms of gender-based violence in regard to the domestic family, intimate partner was very much mute and silenced. CEDAW has now, from a long time ago, has destroyed that distinction. So there is no private sphere anymore. It's a blended sphere of all sectors of our lives are open to being recognized where the violations exist. So for example, marital rape, which is in the private sphere, is no longer, there's no longer immunity for it in many countries. And we're also, or impunity, I should say. And we're now asking, for example, that the Bahamas criminalize marital rape, as there is no distinction under the CEDAW Convention between private and public spheres when it comes to the violation of women's human rights. We also recognize the negative impact of social, customary, and cultural practices which are based on the perceived inferiority or superiority of either sex or on stereotype roles for women and men. And this is really, really important because Article 5 of the convention really zeroes in on gender stereotypes. And we hold that gender stereotypes are really is a cross-cutting issue across all spheres of women's lives. And it is largely gender stereotypes which impact gender-based violence in many ways, issues of gender pay or the wage gap in gender pay, and other areas of women's lives. And so CEDAW recognizes the historic inequalities between women and men. In fact, that is why CEDAW came into existence, is because worldwide, countries, citizens, communities recognize that historically men and women don't have the same access to power. The relations are very skewed, and the access to social resources and human resources are also very gendered in terms of how women and men access those resources. So something like land, for example, access to land, women are very much disenfranchised in regard to the amount of land that we own worldwide. I think men own something like 80% of the land worldwide, that is. And that also breaks down into domestic access to land, particularly for rural women who use land as part of their everyday subsistence, survival, and sustainable lives. So the second way then that CEDAW looks at the issue of gender-based violence and structural violence is by trying to correct continued discrimination against women. It also is very clear that there are intersecting forms of discrimination against women and girls. And so this particular PowerPoint delineates many intersecting forms of discrimination. So it's not just being a woman, it may be that you are a woman and Indigenous, for example, or that you are a woman and lesbian, or that you're a woman and transgender, or that you're a woman with AIDS, or that you are a widowed woman or a married woman. And the kinds of discrimination that we may encounter is compounded by various intersecting forms of discrimination. So if you want to add 3, 4, 5 of those together, you can see that a woman who may be Black, who may be lesbian, who may be unmarried, who may be pregnant, may experience or different kinds of discrimination in different ways. So this here is really a catalog of intersecting forms of discrimination. And so we have to look very carefully at women and the variations of their lives in terms of how discrimination plays out in their lived experiences. All right, so if you are a woman who is in a situation of armed conflict, the kind of discrimination you may experience there too is very different from a woman who may be not in a situation of armed conflict. So we looked recently in November, in October, early part of November, I was in Geneva sitting on the committee, and we looked at, for example, Afghanistan came before us and Yemen came before us. And so both of those countries are in various degrees of situations of armed conflict, and the kinds of violations that women there experience in terms of sexual violence in particular is really, it's really dire, it's really extreme. And so the recommendations that we've made to Afghanistan and Yemen is that, you know, even in situations of armed conflict, there are obligations by the state party to protect, fulfill, and respect the rights of women. Therefore, there should be prevention of issues of sexual violence of women in situations of armed conflict. All right then, so women experiencing varying intersecting forms of discrimination, which have an aggravated cumulative negative impact. The committee acknowledges that discrimination affects women to different degrees, depending on the intersection that they hold, and that therefore the legislation and the policy responses need to be drafted to respond to each and every one of those situations, because it's not a homogeneous woman. All right. So another way that the CEDAW Committee deals with issues of gender-based violence and structural and systemic violence is by creating rights that are designed specifically for our everyday realities. So the convention itself, if you look at it, you won't see the right to a life free from gender-based violence. That is not one of the rights that is embedded in the convention itself. It is a right that the CEDAW Committee has come to accept, and we've put it forward long before I got on the committee to states parties who have ratified it. They too have accepted that there is a right by women to a life free from gender-based violence. And so this is another way that we address the issue of gender-based violence by specifying the kinds of rights that are involved in this kind of violence. So there is a right to a life free from gender-based violence. Gender-based violence then against women and girls, under Article 1, which I showed you earlier, which is the definition of discrimination, gender-based violence constitutes discrimination under the convention. So it is discrimination to perpetuate gender-based violence against women and girls. Therefore, states parties must take every charge that they have to eliminate discrimination, because it feeds into gender-based violence against women and girls. Article 2 of the convention provides the overarching obligation of states parties to pursue all appropriate means and without delay a policy of eliminating discrimination against women, including gender-based violence against women. So there are some articles under the convention which the convention realizes take time, such as, you know, some social rights or economic rights can take time. However, a violation of a woman's body, her bodily integrity, her bodily autonomy, which is gender-based violence, is something that must be addressed without delay. It is not a progressive kind of right that will take time to unfold. It's something that we ask states parties to address immediately when they return home in terms of policies and legislation. All right, so this is a state party obligation of an immediate nature. Delays cannot be justified on any grounds, including economic, cultural, or religious grounds. That tells you the seriousness with which the CEDAW Committee looks at gender-based violence against women and girls. All right, then. The other way that we address issues of gender-based violence is that we, under the convention, we can draft what are called general recommendations. And these general recommendations are what we call our own jurisprudence or our interpretation of articles of the convention. And these general recommendations help to guide both states parties, countries that have ratified the convention, and also NGOs. So NGOs can look at these general recommendations, which detail our views on a particular issue. So General Recommendation 35 looks at gender-based violence against women and gives very detailed responses as to how NGOs and states parties can address this issue of gender-based violence. All right. Now we use the word, I mean, it's evolved over time. The word used to be violence against women. The CEDAW Committee, which sets the international human rights standards and norms under the convention, has utilized the words gender-based violence against women. And we do that to make it more explicit the gendered causes and impacts of the violence. And the term strengthens the understanding of the violence as a social rather than an individual problem. So, which means that it is systemic and it's structural and it's part of the social fabric in which we live our lives. And so it requires the kind of comprehensive responses that look at the systems and the structures where the violence is a part of our socialization. And we ask that this be responded to and addressed through policies, programs, and laws. And so yes, there are individual perpetrators, and yes, there are victims who suffer as a result of gender-based violence. And we've had it in our face very recently in the past couple of weeks. Bella and the young woman who suffered violence from her intimate partner in being run over by the car, etc. So we respond to individual perpetrators and we respond to victims and survivors in several ways. And fundamentally, we look at it as a social systemic problem that needs to be really addressed also at that level in ways that are transformative and preventative. All right, so the committee then considers that gender-based violence against women is one of the fundamental social, cultural, political, and economic means by which the subordinate position of women with respect to men and our stereotyped roles are perpetuated. So we're really talking about patriarchal norms that anchor a lot of the gender-based violence against women. So through its work, the committee has made clear that such gender-based violence is a critical obstacle to the achievement of substantive equality between women and men and our enjoyment of our human rights as laid out in the convention. All right, so General Recommendation 35, and I also recommend that this be a document that NGOs use and read, and it sets out very clearly CEDAW's position in terms of the gender-related factors that impact gender-based violence, men's entitlement and privilege over women, toxic masculinity, and the male need to assert control and power that in order to curtail whatever behaviors they think women ought not to be exhibiting. So these factors also contribute to the explicit or implicit social acceptance of gender-based violence. And I certainly grew up in the Bahamas, where gender-based violence was part of life that was lived. And I mean, we're now understanding that we have to address it by looking at our social acceptance of it, and not accepting it as a social norm, and that there is an international human rights standard that obligates states parties to do the kind of work to eradicate gender stereotypes and the kinds of socializations that are part of our culture in order to address the issue of gender-based violence. So I've said before, gender-based violence occurs in all spheres of human interaction, whether public or private, workplace, leisure, politics, etc. And also in the digital environment. CEDAW has highlighted the issues of cyber violence against women and girls, and the dangers of that. All right. This then these are more quotes taken right out of the General Recommendation 35 that further anchor the issue of gender-based violence being systemic and structural. And it needs to be addressed at that level by states, parties, and NGOs also. All right. Yes, so gender-based violence against women is also affected by political, economic, and social crises, civil unrest, humanitarian emergencies, natural disasters. And we've seen the impact of Dorian, for example, and COVID, for that matter, COVID-19, on the lives of women in particular. And in regard to food insecurity, in regard to housing, lack of housing that women faced during both of those with their children. And yes, all right. So let me just see what time it is, 6:36. Article 5 of CEDAW is the article that addresses specifically gender stereotypes. And it calls upon states parties to modify, take all measures to modify social and cultural patterns of conduct of women and men with a view to eliminating prejudice and customary and all practices which are based on the idea of the inferiority or the superiority of either of the sexes, or on stereotyped roles for women and men. So I've talked about this in different kinds of ways, and to say that this is a cross-cutting issue on all of the articles. And very shortly, the CEDAW Committee is going to embark, we hope, on a general recommendation on gender stereotypes. We will certainly locate it in all of the different articles and show how it impacts public participation in government, decision-making, employment, health matters, and women, for example, living on the family islands. Okay, so this is some further expansion of gender stereotypes and the assumptions that are harmful, and where they are harmful, because sometimes gender stereotypes may not be harmful, but where they are harmful and serve to excuse and justify abuse of human rights, then we address them categorically and say they ought to be eliminated. So in addition, reliance on gender stereotypes and assumptions is harmful where it reinforces gender inequalities or leads to violations of human rights. All right, so it's important for us to identify harmful stereotypes and assumptions. And I'm reminded of two recent studies that have occurred that I'm aware of in the Bahamas, one done by the Crisis Center several years ago, actually, that looked at young students in high school, and it inquired of them about, their attitudes towards gender-based violence, etc. And many of the young boys, young men, said that it was fine for them to knock her upside her head and discipline their girlfriends. And girlfriends also tended to agree that is part of acceptance of their lives. And then recently, there was another study done at the University of the Bahamas in terms of marital rape. And again, the outcome was that people don't believe that marital rape should be criminalized, and that it is really an ongoing consent that women give once they're married to their husbands to have sex on demand. So these are the kinds of things the kinds of socializations and gender stereotypes that here in the Bahamas and worldwide that we need to pay attention to in order to map the kinds of assumptions that endanger women's lives and disregard our right to a life free of gender-based violence. All right, I think I can move on from here. Yes, and just to say at the very end here, where laws, regulations, policies, and justice system practices embody gender stereotypes, they can give rise to gender discrimination and undermine women's equal enjoyment of our rights. So how do NGOs use CEDAW in addressing issues of gender-based violence? And I'm going to end here. There are several ways that NGOs can do this. I think that we need to look at the legal framework within which we exist here in the Bahamas. Whether we are aware of it or not, it impacts how we live our lives. So I'm still, really upset by the fact that we've had 2 referenda here, and neither of them have been effective in changing the constitutional impediments that still anchor gender discrimination against women in the Constitution. And I know you're fully aware of that issue. And so NGOs really can look again and map our legal architecture across the spectrum: the Constitution, our Sexual Offenses Act, our property rights, our employment laws, and see where gender stereotypes are embedded, for one, but also see where there are inequalities and discriminations against women in the legal framework. And so we've got to look at our discriminatory laws and address those. And so CEDAW has also certainly called the Bahamas' attention when it became before us in 2018 to the issue of the constitutional impediments and other, the Sexual Offenses Act, which still has not criminalized marital rape. CEDAW has called the Bahamas out on that and asked them to change it, straight up change it. All right. NGOs can also look at our national policy or lack of national policy on gender equality and gender-based violence. It's been in draft form for decades, and it needs to see the light of day. But prior to that, it needs the input of NGOs to really give it the kind of substance and quality based on international human rights standards that are anchored in the CEDAW Convention. So there's a lot of work that we still need to do in regard to how to use or how to address issues of gender-based violence by using the CEDAW Convention. In regard to prevention of gender-based violence, NGOs have and continue to use educational campaigns to increase awareness of different types of gender-based violence. Femicide is one of the major issues during this particular 16 days of activism. The CEDAW Committee has made several investigations into femicides in different parts of the world: Mexico, Canada, So it's not a new phenomenon, but it certainly is one that we in the Bahamas need to begin to map and to demand that our police force, for example, document, well, first of all, understand the issue of femicide and document it so that we have the kind of evidence-based work that helps us to then make policies to address femicide. I've spoken about marital rape in terms of the need to criminalize it. So, and then one of the other things that we need to do is to look at gender roles within our own Bahamian situation and understand those that feed right into violence, gender-based violence within our homes, within our schools. And one of the ways that we can address it is, in my view, is to have the kind of school curriculum that looks at gender equality and non-discrimination. A comprehensive sexuality education, I think, is also a way to address gender-based violence against women and girls. All right, and so we also need comprehensive victim-centered and gender-responsive policies to prevent gender-based violence, support services for survivors. So the kind of integrated services, that deal with survivors of gender-based violence comprehensively, not just in, you go here for this and you go over here for that, but a kind of holistic treatment and care for survivors to treat all of the different aspects of their body violations, including psychosocial counseling. So, and shelters. I mean, these NGOs have been active in providing shelters for survivors of gender-based violence. The other thing that NGOs can do in advancing, in using CEDAW, is that there are several UN reports. One, the CEDAW report that is out, came out in 2018, that asks states parties to do certain things in terms of gender-based violence. All right, that is to revamp the Sexual Offences Act, include marital rape in it, and these are some of the tools that the NGOs can use to further advance the issue of gender-based violence against women. A special rapporteur on gender-based violence against women also came to the Bahamas in 2018, and she wrote a very comprehensive report on gender-based violence. And I know that Equality Bahamas has all of these documents, actually. And so these can be disseminated. I think one of the problems that I know happens here in the Bahamas is that even though these documents are in the public domain, once delegations come back to the Bahamas, they put the document on a shelf and it sits there. But in fact, the documents are supposed to be disseminated amongst all NGOs, judges, policemen, the public service. The entire country is supposed to have access to these documents. And so I think we as NGOs really need to make our governments accountable for the kind of distribution and access to these documents. After all, they've represented us abroad and they need to come home and tell us what's happened and have us participate in the implementation of the recommendations that have been made. Two last things where NGOs can help a lot, because in fact, CEDAW relies on the work that NGOs do to do our own work. NGOs come to CEDAW and make representations both privately and publicly, and they submit what's called shadow reports or alternate reports to UN human rights bodies. And so in 2018, Equality Bahamas submitted a report. Erin Green made a report, and so did Noel, on what was happening here in the Bahamas that helped us to really understand better a fuller picture. There's one issue here that is still outstanding in terms of the Bahamas. CEDAW has what's called an optional protocol. Now this is, it's also a convention or a treaty, and it's collateral to CEDAW. And under this particular convention, individual women can make complaints directly to CEDAW in regard to violations of our human rights. And unless this optional protocol is ratified, individual women in the Bahamas cannot do this. All right. So one of the things, if you look at the concluding observations, is that we, again, where states parties have not ratified the optional protocol to the UN CEDAW, we ask the government to move forthwith to ratify the optional protocol. So NGOs can hold that up to the government and begin to agitate for us to ratify the optional protocol, which gives us more coverage and more access to having our human rights violations addressed before the CEDAW Committee. All right, well, I think I'll stop there. There's a lot more. I've gone on for about 45 minutes, Alicia, and I hope it's been helpful. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I think that gives us a really good sort of overview of the convention and what it's meant to do. And I know we started off talking about structural violence. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that means? What is structural violence and what are some examples of it?
Yes, sorry about that. Yes. So if I look at the home, for example, all right, which is one of the fundamental institutions I mean, we live in homes. There is violence embedded within our homes. It can be violence against, and the home is a structure. The home is a social structure. All right. And so what we're saying is because of the imbalance of power relations within the home between women and men, there is the possibility, and it happens, that gender-based violence takes place. So you have women who, you have marital rape, for example, where women are forced to have sex with their intimate partners or husbands or spouses because the society expects that. That's part of the norm that's embedded into what the family is about or what marriage is about. So structural violence is violence, whether we can actually see it or whether it's discernible or not, that is part of the life that we live, that we may have accepted as a norm, and that is harmful to us. Embedded in the schools, for example, in terms of structural violence, we have a very blatant structural violence of corporate punishment of children within the schools. And again, we've accepted this as part of the norm of our society. And I remember clearly when CEDAW came before the committee, this whole issue of corporate punishment within schools was it was discussed, and we put forward very sort of almost proudly that this is part of what we've all grown up with, and therefore and it's worked. So this kind of structural violence is a part of different systems and social constructs within which we live. The home, the school, embedded in the church, we have structural violence. Again, because of power relations between church leaders and women in the congregation. We know that rape has taken place within certain religious institutions with impunity. So structural violence is built into many of our institutions. We have sexual harassment within the workplace. We have rape within the workplace, within university institutions. So this is violence that is part of the environment within which we all live, and we have to see it, map it out, and address it based on the context within which it manifests itself.
We have a few people joining us who were also with us on Thursday and Saturday for 2 sessions that were very focused on femicide. And one of the things that came up, I believe, in that first session with Audra from the Global Campaign, she was listing various, these kind of 2 categories of femicide, direct and indirect. And in the indirect group, she mentioned botched abortions as a form of like sort of a state sanctioned femicide. Mm-hmm. How does CEDAW look at the complicity of the state in that kind of violence and that kind of impact on women and girls within the articles that are looking at health and education, for example?
Right. So I'll talk about abortion or access to safe abortion and circle back to what you're saying. Under Article 12, CEDAW has elaborated areas where the state should, we say first of all that abortion as a criminal offense must be decriminalized. That's just the first step. So wherever abortion is criminalized, we ask the state to decriminalize abortion. That's one. Secondly, in many states, including the Bahamas, abortion is criminalized. So 1, decriminalize. 2, legalize abortion in at least 4 areas: sexual assault, rape, life, health of the mother, and also in situations where there is severe deformity of the fetus, and it is unviable in the sense that it won't live after. It won't live. And so we ask for decriminalization and legalization in those areas, and at least those areas. My own personal view is that it should be legalized across the board on demand. All right. However, CEDAW has and so there are ways in which I have different opinions sometimes, and this is one. And
where CEDAW says the health of the woman, do they include mental health?
Yes. Mental health is absolutely part of that. All right. And so for me personally, it should be abortion on demand for whatever reason a woman needs or wants to have an abortion. So that is how CEDAW deals with it: decriminalization, period, and then legalization in those 4 areas. We've gotten there is huge pushback even on that conservative position. To me, that's conservative. On that conservative position, there's huge pushback from many regions of the world. Latin America, the Middle Eastern region, is very resistant to that for cultural reasons and other kinds of reasons. And so what you're asking about botched abortions, which result in maternal mortality, is that what you're saying? Yes. And so CEDAW is very clear that we ask for access to safe abortion. So we just did, when I came onto the CEDAW committee in 2017, we had just finished an inquiry, which is under the optional protocol, where Northern Ireland was separate and apart from the rest of the UK. The UK had access to safe abortion, whereas Northern Ireland, largely because of its very Catholic orientation, was still reserved on the issue of access to abortion. Post our inquiry into the issue, we made it very clear that Northern Ireland, which is a part of the UK, has to have, and it's governed by the same convention, and it ought to be governed by the same UK laws that allow access to abortion, safe abortion. our inquiry showed very clearly that this was a violation of the rights of women in Northern Ireland not to have access to safe abortion. And so the inquiry actually was very instrumental in turning around the issue for women from Northern Ireland in terms of their, many of them used to go to the UK, other parts of like London, for example, to have safe abortions, which is quite an onerous thing to do. So that has been turned around now, and the Northern Ireland's abortion laws fall under the general laws of the UK. So access to safe abortion is a pinnacle. I mean, it's central.
And so would you say that not making safe abortion accessible is a form of structural violence?
Absolutely, yes. Yes. Sorry, I didn't say that, but yes, that's exactly right.
We have a question in the chat. What repercussions, if any, are there for countries or states that fail to meet CEDAW standards of compliance?
Yeah, this is always a question that comes up, and it's a really, really good question. So there are no penal, there's no penalty for any country. There's no criminal penalty for not complying with CEDAW's human rights standards, or any, I shouldn't say any, but some of the other human rights treaty bodies standards. The convention doesn't have that mechanism to penalize a country with a criminal sanction, let's say. That's just not there. So the way it works is that each country is required to come before us, has agreed to come before us every 4 years. It really works out maybe to every 5 years, just because of the time it takes. And there's that. And so the reporting facility mechanism is the one which we use to monitor and really pressure countries to do what they're supposed to do under the convention. The other way that it works too is that there is committee or peer pressure from different countries. So let's say we live in the CARICOM region, for example, all right, and other countries are in other regions, and so we often use comparators of other countries. So, for example, in the Bahamas, marital rape is criminalized in Guyana. So we can say, we can point to Guyana and say, why can't we at least address it in the way that Guyana is done? It's the same kind of cultural system, the same kind of political system. And so we use that kind of regional comparisons often to move countries to another place. And so in countries where you have Sharia law, for example, Sharia law is interpreted in different ways in different countries. And so we can use a more kind of progressive view of Sharia law that could help another country that is really, really conservative in its implementation of certain aspects of the law. So there is no penal sanction, just to clarify that. And there is the reporting requirement and the kind of regional comparisons that we do to move countries forward and have them see it from a different perspective. My other view about that is that when countries go with each other into international bodies, some can hold their heads up really high, in terms of the kind of moral or sort of authority that they have in terms of being leaders in certain areas, like more advanced sexual offenses acts, and others just have to sort of be quiet about it. And I think that is another sort of avenue of peer, the way the peer pressure kind of works. Doesn't always work, but that's a possibility. So the other way that I do need to talk about is that the CEDAW Convention
Hi, Marion, we can see you again.
You're losing me. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not sure what's happening with the connectivity here. What I was saying is that the way to make the CEDAW Convention work best in the Bahamas is by pushing our government to domesticate it, that is to make it part of our Bahamian law. So in some countries where you have what's called a MONIST, a MONIS system, once a convention is ratified, it immediately becomes part of the domestic law. And therefore, it can be used immediately by the rights upholders. In the Bahamas, that's not how it works. It still needs to be made part of our domestic law, which is why we ask the government to use the definition of discrimination and put it into the domestic law and or the Constitution. And so that would be the other way that it could then be utilized by women citizens to uphold our rights in regard to violations of our rights. So I hope I've answered that question about penal sanctions, etc. There isn't one.
Yeah, it's more peer pressure between countries and then a little bit of sort of international shaming to be motivators to states, I guess. We have another question, I guess, about the function of CEDAW. So someone's asking, what are the requirements for belonging to CEDAW? So I think maybe they want to know about ratification. And what are the points that must be met?
For some reason, I'm not hearing you very well.
Okay, what are the points that must be met every 4 years for those who have ratified?
So every 4 years, the government must draft a state report on the status of women under each and every article of the convention. So it has to look at legislation, the Constitution. It has to look at gender stereotypes. It has to look at trafficking in women. It has to address women's political participation in governance and decision-making, health issues, employment issues, nationality issues. So there are 16 articles, and the government has to report on the status of women under each and every one of those articles in full. All right. And so in our dialogue with the country, we then also write recommendations for further advancement or implementation of specific aspects of those articles. And what we do is we highlight 4 that are perhaps the most egregious. And so by the time the country comes back to us over the next 4 years, we are really expecting that those 4 egregious violations are addressed. So it may be something like, I'd have to look at the concluding observations, but if you have a draft bill on marital rape, which is what the government had said, we expect that by the time you come back before us that you've implemented a draft bill. It won't take 4 years to do that. All right, so there are ways in which we understand that not everything will be complied with, but we expect progressive movement on every single article, on every aspect of women's lives. We expect some progress, not just the same that we saw 4 years ago.
So the state looks at the convention and replies to those articles to say, we've made this kind of progress. And then NGOs who do shadow reports do the same thing, noting progress, stagnation, whatever. And then the CEDAW Committee looks at all of that as a whole and identifies the 4 biggest issues, the things that really need to be addressed right away. And they highlight those in the concluding observations or the recommendations. And the expectation is that over that 4-year period, the state is going to work on remedying these issues.
Yes, the state is going to work on it. It's also a tool for NGOs to advocate. So the NGOs would have those concluding observations and those recommendations, and the NGOs can also hold the state accountable for doing what it has agreed to do under the convention. And marital rape is one of those issues.
I see a question about what we've done as a country to work on, I guess, visioning a country without gender-based violence. I'm going to actually come back to that at the end in our sort of call to action. But we have another one. While CEDAW is clearly a useful tool for local NGOs, I have found that persons rebel against gender equality and CEDAW in the name of sovereignty. In other words, gender equality is framed as a foreign pressure as opposed to a local right. How can we achieve more alignment between the two?
Really, really excellent. So here's how I respond to that. I think gender equality is a social justice issue. I think it's an issue of democracy building. It's an issue of nation building. Those are domestic. It's an issue of sustainable development. We have to have gender equality to move towards sustainable development of our entire society. All right, that's one aspect of it: social justice, democracy, nation building. Gender equality has to hold all those things, and we as citizens need to hold that. In addition to that, if we look at the UN, in 1973, the Bahamas became independent, so to speak, and we voluntarily ratified several human rights conventions post-independence. This is voluntary. No country is forced to ratify a convention. You do it because you have a sense of your own sovereignty and place in the world. Therefore, you have to have a sense of your obligations and responsibilities to your citizens in the world too. All right. I also want to make it very clear that human rights is not foreign to the Bahamas. The women's suffrage movement advanced the right to vote for women based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. This document is a public document. We need to look at it. I'm going to say it again. The women are women of the women's suffrage movement. The 1940s, 50s, and 60s women used UN conventions to advance the right to vote, for us to stand for election, to open up other portals of human rights. They didn't just see it as the right to vote and the right to stand for election. They saw it as social justice. They saw it as nation building. They saw it as contributing to who we are as a modern country. So let's not, put ourselves in this box where human rights is foreign to us. It is not. From 1965, the then opposition went to the United Nations to campaign under Lyndon Pindling, Arthur Folks, Doris Johnson. They went to the UN in 1965, for goodness sakes, to petition for democracy, majority rule, desegregation, racism. So we are a country that is steeped in using the UN to advance who we are as a country and a nation. So Randall Fox used the International Labor Organization protocols to advance labor rights in this country in the 50s and 60s. So we have to remember our own history, or we have to know our own history, perhaps, and be very clear that these are not impositions by the UN on the Bahamas. This is an embrace of ourselves, yes, as a sovereign country, yes, as part of an international committee that has agreed to abide by certain international human rights and standards. We jump daily to the Organization of Economic and what is it called, the OECD, to enhance our legislation around banking and trusts, etc. So why can't we do the same in regard to our obligations under the human rights treaties? which advances human rights for human beings. It's people-centered. So let's not talk about impositions, because we jump all the time to all kinds of foreign impositions, and gladly so. Yet we complain when we talk about the UN and its standards, in its human rights standards. So we really have to I think we have to hold all of this and look at it in the ways that I'm suggesting as part of our sustainable development and justice and democracy and nation building.
I think some of it is about framing as well. If you frame something as we have to do this because CEDAW said, as opposed to we need to do this because we made this commitment when we ratified CEDAW, the state willingly of its own volition decided to ratify CEDAW because it saw value there for the people, but we don't frame it in that way. And a lot of that is because representatives, government actors go off to these international spaces and make agreements and do things, and they never come back and tell us about it. So if we're not there seeing it, or if we're not closely monitoring, then we don't know what's happening or why or who's had a hand in it. So I think that's why talking about CEDAW and what's in it is important. But I do think we're starting from way, way, way behind whoever, started the race years before us, because they've already framed it in this way. So people hear the word and they're all of a sudden they're just like, oh, foreign, ooh, imposition. But we have to reframe it. And I also think that there has to be a distinction between the language that we use and our methods when we're dealing with government advocacy and when we're dealing with public education. So when we talk to the government, I think we can talk to them about their obligations. We could talk about treaty bodies and international mechanisms. And when we talk to the public, we need to talk about rights, and we need to talk about how it impacts their daily lives. We have to meet people where they are and find where people's motivations are, because it's all the same thing, but it's really about how we approach different groups of people, I think.
Right. I hear all that you're saying, Alicia, and I amplify it and echo exactly what you're saying. I think you're absolutely right. I think if I just address the issue of how we deal with the government itself, I think it's really important too to have we need data, we need evidence-based policies, and so if we're talking about something like, let's say, comprehensive sexuality education for young people in schools, we really have to somehow be able to show show policymakers how this may well be an effective response to gender-based violence, to adolescent pregnancy. I mean, So I part of what I'm trying to say is that another angle is the health costs of gender-based violence to people individually, but also to the country at large. What do those costs look like when women are battered and unable to go to work and be productive citizens and the kind of access to health services, etc. What are the actual costs of that? I don't know the answer to that, but I would wager a bet that all of that is the kind of documentation and evidence and data that we need to really make some headway in this, in terms of policies and programs. And yes, in terms of meeting people where we are in our own spaces. I think the referendum was a huge example of that, in terms of the language that you're talking about, the kind of language that we use and the kind of framing of the issues has to be understood in very personal, individual ways. And I think language is very important in how we meet people, as you say, as we all say, where we are, because otherwise, we're not getting anywhere.
You brought up the numbers and the cost of gender-based violence, and it's something that, I don't know, the conversation disturbs me a little bit. And I think we're probably going to get into it with the session that we have on data coming up. But I think something for us to think about is how we move people without reducing women to means of production. Like I take some issue with the idea of talking about the cost to the economy when women are unable to work, and the cost or the burden on the health system. Because I think that we're teaching people to care more about what women do for the economy and do for society more than they care about women. And so I struggle to balance that with moving people with the dollar signs. But I think that's something that we definitely have to talk about more.
Right. And so, you know, I hear exactly what you're saying. You're talking about the, you know, instrumentalizing our lives and you know, putting dollars and cents to it. Well, that was exactly my view when we were talking about the referendum. For me, it was really about, you know, again, justice for women across the board, and all of the other things kind of fell away. I think with policymakers, I think that is one of the things that needs to happen. I don't think it should be the only thing that happens. I think the framing of it has to be bigger than the cost issue. But I think cost issue can certainly play a part of what we're, of the wholeness of the picture. I think that's what I would like to say.
Definitely. We have another, let's see, yes, Nicole is saying, yes, framing is a key issue and the language used in different spaces needs to be different for the different audiences. Nicole also saying sex disaggregated data is severely lacking. And she's speaking regionally. Nicole, you're in Trinidad and Tobago, right? We've been saying this for decades. I think I missed a question. 1 second.
It seems to be a very prevalent thing in the region. I mean, almost every time there's talk around data, yes, the data is missing, but there's also text disaggregated data that is missing. And it's not only in Trinidad, I've heard it other spaces too.
Yeah, and I find that the countries that have a UE campus do a little better than those of us that don't with the data.
Don't be fooled by that. Sorry.
No, you don't think so?
at least no. I mean, let me possibly qualify that. In health, it is still a huge piece that is missing. You know, so maybe there are pockets that are doing well, you know, but still, it's still an overall issue that needs to be dealt with. And the impetus to do the research needs to come from us. A lot of the time, the research is coming from the funding agencies, and we don't make the money off of it. We who do the work on the ground don't make the money off of it. They bring in the consultants, they train who they want to train, and we don't. We sometimes don't even know it's going on until it's published, or at least being published. While we who do the work on the ground have no knowledge, and we don't even get the possibility of being trained then to do the work. You know, so there's several ways in which we miss out big time when the impetus from us, impetus to do the research doesn't come from us.
Yeah. Yeah, or it comes from trying to qualify for funding. Yeah. I just found the question that I'd missed. This is for you, Marion. Do you think that the National Development Plan can assist in the Bahamas meeting some, if not most, of CEDAW requirements?
The draft national plan that I looked at is old. You know, it's many years old. So I would think, and if it is still in that state, I've not looked at it recently. If it's still in that state, I think it needs a lot more input from NGOs like Equality Bahamas, and looking at the standards across the board that the convention upholds, and seeing whether the national policy meets those standards. As I recall it, and this was even before I was a committee member of CDAW, that I would have looked at it, you know, at least 5 years ago. or 6 years ago. And I think it needed that kind of attention. And I think it probably still does. So I can't speak directly to that right now in terms of where it is, but I've not seen a new rendition of it. Don't know that it's been put out.
Okay, and then we had a comment from Facebook. In order for women to recognize the need to decriminalize, to criminalize domestic abuse, including marital rape, women must recognize that they are fully formed human beings, not lesser than, but simply different than men. When women can recognize their rights over the autonomy of their own bodies, soon the cultural beliefs start to break away.
Agreed. Well, yep. I would support that.
As I always do, when I
Yes.
see comments like that, or I hear comments like that, I want to remind us that we don't want to frame ourselves as being the problem, but understanding that we are steeped in systems that have taught us certain things about ourselves, and our ways of being and thinking and doing and living and loving and working are shaped by patriarchy and misogyny, a lot of which is internalized. So we do have to work at chipping away at and dismantling these systems, and not chipping away at each other. As we talk about these things that we definitely need to work on, and the things that we need to unlearn together. Did anyone else have any other comments? You can type quick or you can unmute. As long as you don't all do it at the same time, we should be okay. Okay, if not, I can look at that question that I skipped to come back to. Someone was asking, if I can find it again. What have we as a country worked on? Have we as a country worked on what an end to gender-based violence needs to look like in schools, churches, businesses, hospitals, police force, etc., so that when we present it to the government, the plan is already in place? If these have not been created, are there plans to make these happen? I am happy to assist. So there are a lot of things that have been done already that have been sitting for a long time that need to be picked up again. They need to be updated. They need to be refreshed. They need new information added to them, new research, new data integrated. They include the strategic plan to end gender-based violence, which was mentioned in Marion's presentation earlier. That was in 2015. That was completed by the Task Force on Gender-Based Violence, which was chaired by retired Justice Ruby Nottage and co-chaired by Dr. Sandra Dean Patterson and Dr. Robin Roberts. And that was pretty wide consultation with different people in different spheres, different areas of expertise. And it's just been sitting. So that's something that we need to pick up again. There are numerous other things like that. There's supposedly a gender policy in the works. It would be great to see that draft, to be able to contribute to it. Again, the people who are involved in these processes seem to be cherry picked a lot of the time. So we need to sort of force our way into these processes and demand that we see these documents and the public has a chance to participate in the process. And that way it also doesn't seem like a foreign concept when it's on the table. People feel like they've had their say, they've been able to contribute, much like the National Development Plan, the Vision 2040, I think it was. Equality Bahamas, since July, has been working on feminist standards for governance, where we have had a number of working sessions on Zoom, collaborative working sessions, and we've had a survey open for a while. If somebody has a link handy, you could drop it in the chat. But we're asking questions about health, education, women and LGBTQ plus people, youth, social services, labor and economy, and environment. And then we have 3 critical areas of concern. Gender-based violence is the first one. The next one is climate change, and the last one is disaster management. So we're asking for inputs on those. What are some of the issues? What solutions do you have in mind? What are your ideas? What do we need to do to move forward? And this would be sort of a people's agenda for the government over the next 5 years. This is a great time to do it. The government is new. They're still paying attention to what we say. So please put your thoughts into that survey. You can answer as many or as few of the questions as you like. You don't have to answer each one to be able to submit. So that's one way that you can contribute. We also have our policy recommendations to end gender-based violence, which we worked on during the last 16 days campaign in 2020. We have the summary of points that's available. We'll share the link to that as well. If you go to the overview document for this year's 16 days, you'll find a sort of graphic that breaks it down. So we have a little bit of an intro, and then we have recommendations on prevention, response, and justice. So you can have a look at that. And then we have the monthly Women's Wednesdays discussions where we talk about a whole broad range of issues that are related to sustainable development towards human rights, women's and LGBTQI plus people's rights in particular, and feminist policy development. So continue to engage with us. There are always opportunities to contribute to policies and recommendations and pieces of work to move us forward and to present to the government of the day. All right, so we have all those links in the chat. The short link to access everything about 16 days 2021 is tiny.cc/go16, but tiny.cc/go16. And there you will find a list of all the events, links to register. If the events are over, then you'll find a link to the recording on Facebook as well as YouTube. And if you keep scrolling, you'll get to our list of demands, as well as a breakdown of 16 CEDAW recommendations from 2018 that we still need to work on. And they're like bite-sized little graphics that are really easy for you to save and share on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, wherever. You could even drag and drop them into emails and send them to your friends, and amplify these calls for the government to pay attention to these recommendations that were put forward in the concluding observations in 2018. It's time to report again, and we still have not dealt with a lot of these issues. So every day we'll be putting out another one per day, so we'll have 16 at the end. Keep an eye on that document and on our social media to find them. And then, Lauren, can you give us a quick look at what we have coming up next, the next couple of events before we shut her down for the night?
Yes, so this week is a full week of events for us. Tomorrow at 6 p.m. via Zoom, we will be chatting with Dominic Duncombe, Stephen Thompson, and Lagi Saru from Fiji. So it's a conversation for men on gender-based violence. So oftentimes when we have conversations about GBV, people will ask, well, what about the men? So tell them to show up. This is their opportunity. And they can register at tiny.cc/16 days 3011. So that's 30th of November. Tiny.cc/16 days 3011. And then on Wednesday, we have a workshop with Brendane Tynes. She is a scholar and activist based in the US. And her workshop is entitled Rememory as Method. So we're looking at how we can use writing to sort of reclaim our power. It's also a nice break from some of the heavier conversations we're having. So we hope you'll join us for that as well. That's happening at 6 p.m. on Zoom on Wednesday. Then on Thursday, again at 6 p.m. on Zoom, we have a session with Kelly Jolly, Jessica Russell, and Kaiden Regis, who will be talking about community responses to GBV. And the registration link for that is tiny.cc/16 days 212. So that's the 2nd of December. And then on Saturday, we have a movement workshop that's being facilitated by Shanae Maya, who is a local dancer, choreographer, dance educator, and that is happening at noon on Saturday over Zoom. Registration link is tiny.cc/16days412. And then, believe it or not, we have some sessions after that. So we hope that you will join us for one or more of these sessions next week. And, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. We're posting all of the event details there, as well as some of the recordings in case you missed a session. So thank you for joining us for our conversation with Marion this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you very much, Marion, for sharing your expertise with us. I know it was quite a lot, everyone, that we tried to get in there, but hopefully you have a better general idea now of what CEDAW is and how we can use it to address gender-based violence, and some of those specific articles that we can look at throughout the next few days and beyond, because we're going from 16 days of activism to 365 days of activism. So the things that we're talking about now, we're planning to take them with us into 2022 as some priority areas. Thank you all for joining us. Marion, do you have anything else that you want to say before we?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to Equality Bahamas and Alicia and your team for what you do year round. I think you've already said it's 365 days. It's not 16 days of activism. And I am totally convinced that the work, and I know that the work that you are doing and continue to do, all of you, all of us, is just really important. And the ground is being tilled. I know that. I mean, I can feel some of the shifts, and that are taking place in our lives and in our communities because of the work that you do. And so I really respect and whatever I can do, and I need to really be. I'd love to be much more on the ground and involved in Equality Bahamas than I am, but you can call on me, and I'm with you in spirit, there's no question about it, and support the work that you are doing. And I just want to say thank you to you and Lauren and Mia and the entire team of Equality Bahamas for all that you do. It's important.
Thank you, Marion. Thank you for always being there when we call and rooting us on every step of the way. We need it. We need the cheerleading and the push and the history, because sometimes we forget that there's a history and that there was so much work done before us, and we have to be reminded of it, and we have to remind other people of it, and know that we're building on something that was here before we came. Yeah, so thank you, everybody. I'm going to end this recording. It will be available on Facebook, and give us a few minutes, and then it will be on YouTube as well for ease of sharing. Thank you for joining us. Dudes, people who know dudes, people who just want to eavesdrop on the dudes tomorrow, they'll be having that conversation. And then, as Lauren mentioned, there's all these other events, tiny.cc/go16 to get all the details. Thank you to Lauren and Mia for all the behind the scenes work that's going on all the time with the social media and the monitoring the chat and everything. Many thanks to everyone. Have a good night, everybody, and see you later in the week.